Coke versus Pepsi, Beatles versus Elvis, Star Wars versus Star Trek, and Action Force versus G.I. Joe? Let's talk about this. Jay here with Nerd Rage Against the Machine, and I know it's been a while. I've had some family issues, some personal issues, but hopefully we're going to see some more content. I do, again, apologize for the lack of it for a while, and I appreciate you guys sticking with me, at least in the meantime. So, saying that, I'm here today to talk a little more about the Valaverse Action Force line and its comparison to G.I. Joe. So first off, part of my original problems with the Action Force line came in their availability. And this is something that I've always felt is kind of a tough thing. And I understand that, Valaverse is a much smaller company than Hasbro. But the fact that, again, despite every effort they were trying to curb scalper behavior, it seemed like it was only egging scalper behavior on. When you see figures online for $100, $200 that should cost $30 at most, that's a lot of bull. Sorry guys, that's the way it is. But I think they have come a long way in fixing that problem. The other problems I have with the line are pretty much non-existent. Like anything, you can always find something to gripe about, but again, that's not what we're here for. So today I decided what I'd like to try to do is kind of go through a more real-world compare and contrast between Action Force and its actual competition. So I'm going to start by just saying this. Action Force is a derivative product. Now, saying that, I want to make sure that we understand each other. And when I say it's a derivative product, I'm not saying that it's unoriginal or it's a knockoff. The difference being that a knockoff is done for sheer quick cash grab. So as an example, every time a Disney movie came out and there was a Korean animated version of something similar, like Mulan. Okay, well, we made a Mulan story. Some animation house in Korea made a Mulan story, so we flood the market with those DVDs so Grandpa and Grandma buy this for their kids instead of the Disney one, because the Disney one's not out yet. That is a knockoff. A derivative product simply means that somebody saw something they really liked, but also saw the flaws in it and created their own version. The old Bender, I'm going to create my own moon with blackjack and hookers. It's more that. Some good examples of this would be like The Boys, which is clearly if you will, a derivative work of DC Comics and the Justice League and other comic books, but done with a different eye. Done with that more deconstructive mentality. What would a superhero world really be like if it was corporate controlled and all that? Babylon 5 and the Orville are good examples as well. These are both derivative works of Star Trek. But Babylon 5 did an amazing job of creating a long-term storyline, something that Star Trek never really did until like Discovery. And the Orville also took kind of a more askew comedic look at a 21st century life. Now, again, these are not knockoffs because they are something where the person who created them is trying to do something with that same vein. And that's the same thing here. It's pretty clear that, again, there would be no Action Force without G.I. Joe's existence. I think anyone who wants to argue otherwise is going to just simply be wrong. But saying that, you can see that there's a lot of differences, at least in story-wise. I've read the first 3 issues of Action Force, and they are definitely a much more adult take on this. This is clearly meant for an older audience. You're not going to have stories like The Viper coming out of the Action Force line, or Cold Slither. None of that stuff's going to happen, because again, it's never been aimed at kids. However, again, it does owe some of its lineage, at least a small amount, to the inception creation of G.I. Joe, specifically G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, the toy line and cartoon from the 80s, and comic book from the 80s. Having said all that, what I'm going to do going forward in this video, what you're going to see next, is a compare and contrast between two figures. And these two figures are Duke for G.I. Joe and Condor from Action Force. Now, I chose these two for a very specific reason. These are both the leaders. They are also both blonde. They both are kind of similarly designed, at least on a base level. You know, it's kind of unfair to say compare Snake Eyes and Steel Brigade, or you know, Zartan and Karak, or some of the other ones, because again, you know, they're really not designed to look the same, and the stories are not the same. So I'm going to basically do a quick breakdown of both figures and kind of what I think of them from a design standard. But I wanted to kind of start by just kind of talking about, you know, the worlds themselves and where they are. So yeah, I do think that they're both good lines, but let's go ahead and break down each figure a little more succinctly. Okay, so here they are side by side. This is Duke from G.I. Joe Classified, and this, of course, is Condor from Action Force. Now, again, you can see a lot of similarities. The tan and green design, and again, these guys are both meant to be the commanders of their respective units. That's the reason I really wanted to compare and contrast these two specifically, as opposed to, you know, some wild, you know, Baroness versus Karak kind of thing. Saying that, let's start with the sculpt. Honestly, the face sculpt on both these figures is very well done. I think they both look great, at least in the face. I'm going to kind of go down the figures on both of these, but the face looks good. I think that the dry brushing on Duke is maybe a little more pronounced than it is on Condor, but I do think Condor's face looks really well done, and again, no complaints there. Nothing shiny. He's a little darker skinned, which you might see because it looks to me like the light is kind of overbearing Duke a bit. But again, both faces look good. Going down there, I do like that Duke has kind of the open shirt design, which, you know, looks more, I don't know, to me it looks more workaday versus the straight up neck shirt that, or collarless shirt that Condor is wearing. This, again, is something microscopic. This is not me saying, you know, obviously Classified is way better because, you know, Duke's got a collar. No, just, you know, again, my preference in design. Now, as far as the vests, one of the common complaints about the G.I. Joe Classified figures is that any vests they have are, of course, not removable without, you know, an X-Acto knife and an acknowledgement that you've just ruined the figure, whereas Action Force does have little mushroom clips to remove the vest. Saying that, the downside to those Action Force vests is they are a pain to get back on. Believe you me, and I have tried multiple attempts on multiple figures, and for that very reason, Condor's vest is not coming off of my figure without some damn good reason. But saying that, you know, both these are actually removable at this point. The one thing I will say, as far as sculpt goes, is Duke has the ab crunch, which will affect articulation. If I were to remove the vest from Condor, which I will not, you would see he actually has an ab rocker, as opposed to where it's like a ball joint separating the ribs from the rest of the torso, which is a lot more flexible and will aid in his articulation, which we'll talk about a little later. Going down the figure, you know, again, Duke has the belt that's movable. His is too, but it's a lot less pronounced. Duke does have the sidearm, as does Condor, and the med kit. And Condor's outfit probably looks a little more realistic, whereas Duke's is more fantasy. The one thing I want to bring up here is, you know, I know that there's been a lot of talk about Hasbro's weird, you know, pivot from this almost video game Fortnite look to, you know, trying to go back to the retro look. You know, everything looks as 80s as possible. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that Hasbro had this idea that you know, much in the way that in the 80s a cartoon brought them a lot of popularity, that the video game that they were releasing would do the same thing. And I say that because the role-playing game also uses this aesthetic. I mean, exactly this aesthetic for most of the characters. And so I think that this was the idea, was that they were going to, use this new design as a marketing blitz again. Hasbro thinking that the Fortnite video game look was in with the kids. Unfortunately, it was kind of one of those trying to be one thing to everyone, you're nothing to anyone kind of things. It's not a terrible look, but I can understand why collectors hated this, especially with some of the more sci-fi feel. Again, could be worse, but it really comes down to your personal preference on any of these designs. And again, I think that Condor does definitely look more like a grounded military character. Saying that, let's move on to talking about the weapons. I think that's a big one here. Is you can see that Condor's gun is a lot more realistic, and what's more, removable clips with spare clips actually in the ammo belt of his vest, which is a very cool look. Whereas again, Duke's gun is a lot more like a Nerf gun, and again, multiple reasons for this. One, being a video game character effectively. Two, Hasbro having the ability to license this weapon as opposed to it looking like an AR-15 or an AK-47 or an MP3. Having that ability to license, because again, then they could sell Nerf's gun as, this Nerf gun as Duke's gun or Snake Eyes' gun or what have you. Again, definitely a marketing decision, whether you like it or hate it. I understand it. Also, the fact that G.I. Joe has always, and probably always will anymore, opt for a military fantasy mentality, i.e., yeah, it's the military, but it's not really the military. The idea of Cobra not having a real political statement, it's just simply the bad guy. And again, going back to the same idea that Hasbro has always been selling that mentality a lot. Well, this is more of that. Of the two of them, yes, I think he looks a lot better in the more military style. Articulation, they're pretty close except for that rocker. I think that rocker really helps. Now, the other things that you hear a lot about people talking with Action Force is the pinless joints. To me, yes, that's an improvement. No, it's not enough to sell me on the figures. One of the things that G.I. Joe has over Action Force, of course, is that retro legacy. That, I really want a Storm Shadow. I really want this character. Whereas, the characters in Action Force are cool, don't get me wrong, but, it's that whole idea of, best analogy I can think of is, for those of you who play RPGs, D&D to Pathfinder. Pathfinder was designed as a game that was, again, a derivative work, but an improvement. We hate D&D because it did this, this, and this wrong with its new edition. Here's how I would fix that. Great. However, it's not officially D&D. If I want to run Castle Ravenloft, I still would want D&D. And it's the same thing here. The Action Force figures are great. The figures look good. And they have some really cool characters, but, they're never going to have Cobra. They're never going to have Zartan or Major Blood or Gung Ho. Even if they come close, it's not really them, as it were. And so I think that there's always going to be that, that point of Hasbro has those characters. They're not going to get rid of them. And so there are going to be people who will always buy the classified stuff just because it is those characters that they want or that they miss. Having said that, though, I don't want to sound like that's my attempt to say that that's why Classified is better than Action Force, as much as it is, a reason why fans will choose G.I. Joe over Action Force despite any improvements Action Force makes. Action Force is going to have, in short, a little harder hill to climb. However, I do think that the figures are well done. especially considering the size of the company. I have heard complaints about the cost difference, although with Hasbro's new price rises, I don't see that as big of a deal as it used to be. And again, you do get some more amenities with the Action Force figures, and they are more realistic. They're definitely designed with an adult collector's eye in mind, and that's the one difference between these two lines is, again, comparing it to Pathfinder to D&D. Pathfinder was built on here's what players were wanting to do, whereas Wizards of the Coast at that point, especially with 4th edition, had went with D&D, video games is a kill in D&D. Let's go ahead and just make this as much like a video game as possible, which pissed off a lot of gamers, which is why people went to Pathfinder. And I see the same thing here, where, Hasbro decided that the video game mentality was where we needed to go with this stuff, and that gave a group like Valaverse a perfect in to say, you know what, no, we're going to make something that's more like what you would have wanted as a kid, now as an adult. And so now Hasbro is playing a lot of catch-up because of that. I think that ultimately both lines have their merits, but yeah, I get why people are really praising Action Force at this point. So what are your thoughts? Having looked at these figures both together and apart, do you think that Action Force is going to cream G.I. Joe? Do you think G.I. Joe has a chance, or Hasbro has a chance to kick these guys off the market? I don't really know that that's going to be the case, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about this in the comments below. In the meantime, happy collecting, and I bid you adieu.